Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me. Hey, everybody. Thanks again for joining me today as we look at the God's laws in the book of Exodus. He's explaining to Moses, and Moses is explaining to the Israelites all the different laws that his people are to now obey. Now that they've been saved by God, they're called into obedience, into living for Him and not for themselves. And we're going to look at a couple of the laws that God gives his people in chapter 21. There's a whole section really on what to do if someone is injured by another person, and also what masters and slaves should do for one another. It's worth you reading the whole chapter. It's quite interesting to see the kinds of laws that God places over the Israelites. But I just want to show you a good example that has something to do with this glass right here. I'll tell you that bit in a minute. So I'll read a couple of verses from 18. Two men might argue, and one might hit the other with a rock or with his fist. The hurt man might not be killed, but he might have to stay in bed. Later, he might be able to get up, and he might be able to walk around outside with his staff. Then the one who hit him is not to be punished, but he must pay the injured man for the loss of his time, and he must support the injured man until he is completely healed. So this is just a little law that God is giving his people where perhaps two people get in a fight, and they might be so angry with one another that they try to hurt one another. They try and have a punch up, really. And God is giving them instructions on how to deal with this, on what they're to do. So if the man isn't too badly hurt, he might need to rest for a couple of days and not work. He might need some time maybe with a doctor or just recovering in bed. Well, the person who's hurt them is meant to care for them, pay for whatever time they've lost at work, and to make sure they get back to completely healed, back to normal. So God lays out all kinds of practical things like this for people to follow. If this happens, then do this. And if this happens, then do this. Well, we've got another example where the person who might be injured might be a mum with a baby in her belly. From verse 22, let's have a look. Two men might be fighting, and they might hit a pregnant woman, so the baby has to come out, but there is no further injury. Then the man who caused the injury must pay money. He must pay what the woman's husband says and the court allows. But if there is further injury, then the punishment is that life must be paid for life. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. It is also hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Now, this one is all about protecting one another and what happens if something serious happens. Now, if even someone else, like a woman with a baby in her belly, gets hurt, and if they're okay, well, then there's no serious punishment. But if they're not, well, then that's taken very seriously by God, very seriously by the Israelites. And God basically says, what harm you do to someone, they can do back to you. What you do to someone, they are entitled to do back to you. It's kind of trying to be fair, trying to say if you are hurt by somebody else in this Israelite community, well, then they will be hurt in return. It's meant to hopefully balance out how people are hurt. And if they are hurt, then hopefully it balances back with someone else being hurt as well. But why I read this verse is because it's a good example, because Jesus also quotes this verse further on in the Bible, way down in the book of Matthew. Why don't we flick there? And this is where my glass comes into play. Now, I want you to think of this like a magnifying glass. The bottom of a cup doesn't always do it perfectly, but I want you to imagine that the bottom of this glass, as I look through it, is kind of like a magnifying glass. Can you see me in it there? Hello. Well, when you look through a magnifying glass, it kind of changes how you see things, doesn't it? Some things get bigger, some things get smaller, depending on how you look at it. And God's laws are a little bit like that. In the Old Testament, the Israelites had to follow all of them. But do they all apply to us? Well, no, because we're not Israelites. We have to look at them through a magnifying glass, through what Jesus said. And Jesus keeps some of the laws, does away with some of the laws, and even makes some of the laws bigger than they were. Should we have a read from Matthew chapter 5? This is a passage where Jesus is telling his people, kind of like Exodus, what they are to do. He's giving them a big long sermon on how they are to live with him. Now here's what he says. Now here's what he says about not fighting back. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's quoting our Exodus passage. But I tell you, don't stand up against an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, well then turn and let them slap you on the left cheek too. If someone wants to sue you in court and take your shirt, well then let them have your shirt and coat as well. If a soldier forces you to walk with him 1 mile, then go with him 2 miles. If a person asks you for something, then you give it to him. Don't refuse to give to a person who wants to borrow from you. You see, Jesus makes this law totally different, doesn't he? In the Old Testament, it's if you're hurt, the person who hurt you will be hurt back. That's the way they kept order in the Israelite community. But with Jesus, he's saying no longer. If someone hurts you, well, it's our job to be so like God, so kind, that we might even allow them to do it twice. He wants us to be so like him. Because remember, Jesus was slapped and beaten. They took his clothes and they hung him on a cross. And he would do it again because that's how much he loves us, his people. So as we look through the magnifying glass, Jesus changes all kinds of things about the law. It's kind of like as a kid, your parents give you rules, don't they? They say things like, don't touch the stove because it's hot, or ask before you can use sharp things like knives. These are good rules. Now, other rules might be you need to sit down to eat your dinner, or be kind to each other in your home, or all sorts of rules. Now, as you grow up, those rules might stay or change a little bit. As you're older and more able to do things, well, you might be allowed to use the stove or knives in new ways as you grow up and learn how to use those things. But rules like being kind, sitting down to eat, well, they might continue in your household. You see, God's law was always about pointing us to the person who could keep the laws perfectly, who would show us how the law would work. And he's like a magnifying glass, or like growing up with our rules. Most of them change in some way. Some stay the same, and some even more are made bigger, especially the ones about how we love God and love people. And that's what most of the New Testament is all about.